दोनों ओर के सैनिक पांसे की नोकों पर नर्तन करते अपने विरोधी को हराने के लिए आगे बढ़ते जा रहे हैं। प्रत्येक दिव्यास्त्र को उचित दिव्यास्त्र से रोका जा सकता है, लेकिन उनका चयन योद्धाओं की बुद्धि पर निर्भर है। कुरुक्षेत्र के इस युद्ध में क्या आप जीवित बच सकते हैं, इसका निर्णय भाग्य और योद्धाओं के कौशल के हवाले है। जानिए, आपको मिलती है वीरगति या बनते हैं सम्राट युधिष्ठिर के राज्य का हिस्सा। खेलिए महाभारत युद्ध पर आधारित यह रोचक खेल, रणभूमि कुरुक्षेत्र।
I welcome everybody to another session of Kahi Suni. Today we have with us Aditi Banerjee. She is a published author. She has written books like The Curse of Gandhari and The Vow of Parvati. And she's a working attorney. I welcome Aditi ji to this session. And today we'll be talking about the story, her story, The Language of Deities, in a book called The Flight of Deities. We'll link the link in the description below. Without any further delay, let's begin. First, I welcome you, Aditi ji, to this session. Thank you so much for joining us.
Could you thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Can we please begin with you introducing something, an outlining of the story to the audience so that they can connect to the session more?
Sure. So this story is part of the Flight of the Deities anthology, which is based on Meenakshi Jain's tremendous book that just has the history of how so many of our deities were, people risked their lives to rescue, protect, hide deities all across India when they were under attack from the invaders. And so the idea was to have that Indic Academy was to have an anthology of stories based on that book to kind of further connect with audiences and bring this home more. So this particular story I wrote is about Govinda Dev Ji. So what the legend has it that Vajranabha wanted to see an image of his great grandfather Sri Krishna, and at that point, the only person left alive who had actually seen him in person was Uttara. So based on her descriptions, he made multiple images. And 3 of them were considered to be actually like real. Where Uttara said, "Yes, you've captured it." So one captures his feet, the other captures his chest, I believe, and then this third one is Govinda Dev Ji, where it's Sri Krishna's face has been perfectly captured, just the way he was in his physical appearance on Earth. And so this Vigraha was there in Vrindavana. It was a grand temple there. And then, so this is the true history. And then when Vrindavana and that region was under attack, so Rajputs from Jaipur, this king had come and actually had the Vigraha and the deity moved to Jaipur, and an elaborate temple was built. And I think the journey itself took about 25 to 30 years. For that deity to actually make it to Jaipur. And then it's one of the grandest deities there. So I'll talk a little bit about my experience at that temple later. But the story actually starts when the deities, so there's Govinda Dev Ji, and then there's Radharani who accompanies him later. And it's there in this temple, and then there's a new Purohit appointed to take care of them. And this Purohit doesn't really want to be taking care of them. He wants to be a great scholar. He wants to go to Kashi. He wants to go to the Himalayas. He has all these dreams of what he actually wants to do. But for his family, he has to take this position. And so the story is really about kind of over time this relationship he has with them, and he kind of hears this command or this voice from the deities, and it's about how at first he doesn't want to hear this instruction where there's a particular flower in Vrindavan and things like that. And then this journey that he goes on through his relationship with Sri Radha Krishna or Govinda Dev Ji and Radharani. And I'll leave it there. But it's really about kind of this personal relationship between him and the deities, and this quest that he goes on, and this conflict that he has where he really wants to go away, become a great scholar, and yet he owes this service to the deities. And it's also about the perspective of life from the deities themselves. So they're actually also characters in the story, and they have conversations among themselves also.
I really think that is one of the highlights of the story, and I'm going to come to that later. Before that, I would like to, ask you. There's this thing that we say in literature that stories speak to us, to the writers or to the audience. Stories speak. So, what was so special in this story that spoke to you, which the other stories couldn't? What was so special that in this story that had you entranced so much in it?
So for me, it starts with the experience behind the story. So when I was about like 13 or 14 years old, my family had gone to Jaipur, and we'd gone to this temple, this Govinda Dev Ji temple. And I didn't know anything about it when I went there, but we were just there for the evening aarti, and it really made a strong impact on me. Like all these years later, I can still remember it perfectly. And we were there for the aarti, and I was really entranced by the darshana I had. And it's really true, like when you see the face of Govinda Dev Ji, like you feel like that's like Sakshat Bhagavan Shri Krishna, like standing there. And I remember, during the aarti, like my parents were also there. My grandmother was there, and suddenly, like from like there's a big, like where the mandap is, like a purohit came and gave like a huge tray of like aarti, prasad to my father. And my father was very startled because he wasn't expecting it, and things like that. But the rest of his life, he always remembered this as like a huge like blessing, and this kind of like this leela of what had happened. And I remember when we went back to the hotel that night, like I just had the kirtan that was playing after the aarti was kept going on in my head. So it had a very profound experience on me. So I had this attraction for these deities. So when I thought about writing it, like I wanted to write about them. Then the other part of it was I've done like the Govardhan Parikram a few times. So like outside Vrindavan, it's like I believe 21 kilometer parikram around the Govardhan mountain. And if you go on the top, there's actually a temple there for Srinath Ji. So the Srinath Ji that's in Natadwara in Rajasthan, like the original temple was there. And I remember the first time I went to that temple, I just started crying because I felt this profound sense of grief and mourning because that had been his place. And Natadwara and Srinath Ji had been like taken from his home and taken somewhere else. And so that was another thing I wanted to explore, which is like the sense of like loss and transportation and finding a new home, like going from Vrindavan to like Rajasthan. And we always think from the human perspective and the sacrifices made by people to protect the deities, but also thinking from the deities themselves who are uprooted from their homes and taken somewhere else, and how do they create a new home for themselves. So those were like the different threads that kind of came together in this story for me.
So basically, it's not just a story written in a very short span of time. This story has a work of years behind it. I feel that way.
Yes.
So interestingly, when the entire anthology or the book explores the attacks which are done on various temples, yours is a story which talks about reconstruction of a temple, rather a new beginning, basically. But it also depicts the sense of loss and mourning that the people feel from where the deities have been taken away, and even the deities feel that sense of loss. So do you think that our generation specifically has this new generation today has this innate grief and this loss of identity and this longing, since we have lost that culture, that immensely important part inside of us? Could you please talk a little bit about it?
I think there are different aspects to it. So one aspect is that I think like Hindu dharma is it's experiential, so right, so it's not based on So the whole point is when you have when you go through dharma, when you have like mukti or moksha, it's through self-realization. So knowledge is supposed to be like direct. So you have to have the anubhuti, you have to have the direct experience of it. Otherwise, it doesn't count. And so I think nowadays what has happened is a lot of us, we don't actually practice, whether it's like puja or worship or sadhana or those things. And so it's become very like abstract and intellectual. And so we have that loss of experience. And so I think even understanding what a deity really is, or that I think like for our grandparents and our ancestors, they had like personal relationships with deities. So I know like my great grandfather, he would go to so he's in Kolkata, so he'd go to Puri like every summer. He would take the family there. And when he was young, the first time he went to Puri, he was like, what kind of god is this? Like his arms are like cut off, because Jagannath has a very unique form. And immediately after that, like he actually injured his arm. And so from that moment on, he had like a very strong attraction to and like this very deep belief in Jagannath. So it wasn't just like blind faith. He actually had an experience or like a kind of a relationship. There are stories also like when they stayed in their house at night, they could hear like the chiming of the anklets as the gopis were dancing, like the Raslila, things like that. So these were like very real things. And now we've become kind of very alienated from that. So I think there's kind of that loss of understanding. But yet, to your point, I think there is also still this grief and the sense of loss that's kind of subliminal. So it's almost intergenerational. So I think when you see things like what's happening in Ayodhya or Kashi or things like that, it taps into something where we have this civilizational DNA, or we have this sense of there was something very important here that's been taken from us, and there is this sense of loss. And so Rajat Mitra calls it like intergenerational trauma. So this is like it's actually like a real thing. So I do think there is this profound sense of loss or mourning for what has happened in our history, which we're actually not, through like our education, through the media and things like that, we're almost like not allowed to even acknowledge that or think about it or talk about it, which actually by suppressing it makes it all the more painful and in a way like destructive. And so so definitely tapping into that. But I did also want to talk because it is very important to focus on the struggle and the battle and all of that. But I did want to, in my story, talk about, like you said, the reconstruction and how do you start again. And maybe for me, part of it also is because I was born and brought up in the US. And so I think a lot about how do you take those traditions and those religion and then the deities from a different land and make them feel at home here. So that also has like a personal element for me.
Okay, so when we talk about this thing, a tug between intellectualism and faith, the protagonist of the story becomes very important in depicting this tug of war, these binaries. If I can say that, there's another character, the mystical sadhu, who becomes a supporter of intellectualism almost. So would you like to elaborate something about elaborate on this two binaries?
Yes. So it's kind of this idea, and I think we find this nowadays where there's a lot of emphasis on what's mocked as like ritualism or superstition or something that's primitive or something that we should just kind of get rid of, and instead we should just be very like philosophical and intellectual and kind of like scientific. And it's based on a very like misunderstanding and creating a dichotomy where there really is none. But I think we see this a lot today, where people are kind of what I call like pseudo Vedantins, but they don't understand like the other aspect of it. And so the story for me, because stories should always be about like a struggle or a conflict. So the protagonist in the story should have been someone who doesn't naturally have an affinity towards the deities, but starts from a different perspective. So for me, it made sense that he would be someone who's very interested in like the shastras and being a scholar, but in like a very dry sense of the word, without understanding like the harmony between them. And so the idea that he would so many times a day have to cook bhog for the deities, feed them, dress them, and all of that. And he just sees this all as a waste of time. And then he has this, and so then there's this other like this sadhu who gives him this opportunity to to go away and to go where he wants and become like a great scholar and things like that. And so he thinks that is what he wants to do. And then there's this moment that happens because he hears in his mind that there's some kind of flower in Vrindavan, in the old temple where they stayed, so that voice of the deities is in his head, but he doesn't even know what that means, like what the message is, what they want him to do, but he also can't get rid of that voice. And then at the moment he's about to depart with the sadhu, he actually sees something. And when he sees something, it has like this emotional impact on him, and it takes him into a different journey to Vrindavan. And then when he goes, he has like this kind of profound transformation, and then he comes back and he has like another experience. So the story is kind of about these experiences and how this relationship with the deities actually changes him from who he was at the beginning to something very different at the end. And so I think it's important because it's not to say that you shouldn't be a scholar or that the shastras aren't important or things like that, but it's just in his balance and in his journey, there was something that he needed to learn. And that made everything that had felt so important to him at one time kind of become meaningless. And so it was really wanting to show that impact that the deities had on him, but also kind of the affection that Radharani and Govinda Devji have for him, because they're not doing this because they want a flower, they want something, but they're actually trying to help him in his journey. And so this relationship between us and Bhagavan or our deities or our Ishta or whatever, there's a real sweetness to it. And I think nowadays we think of like, because we don't practice the puja, or we don't really practice bhakti as much as we do kind of what I call more dry intellectualism, we've lost a lot of this. And so I really wanted to show that, along with the sense of like loss and moving from one place to another and all of that. So that was a central part of the story for me.
There's a thing that my mother says. You reminded me of that. You can achieve something in one moment of bhakti which you could not achieve from years of intellectualism, in a way. So that is something I relate to very much myself. So this transformation that you're talking about, the protagonist is not really a religious person, but at the end, when he brings this flower, giving up his seeking, which is this knowledge which he's been seeking since so long, this entire journey of the character, which takes him from so many places emotionally, not physically, so on so many planes. Could you talk a little bit about that also?
Sure. So I'll just So from the beginning, like I said, he really wanted to go and become this great scholar and attain all this vidya, and but he didn't want this so much from the thing of like kind of like a sincerity of knowledge, but he just kind of, there's a bit of ego there that he wanted to be like renowned as a great scholar. And so then what happens is, like I said, he has this I'll just describe what happens. But basically he's given this opportunity to go with the sadhu and become the scholar, and then he sees this girl with a flower being braided into her hair, and he understands like there's this moment of this tenderness between this couple that he's looking at, and then he kind of understands. It resonates with him because he thinks about Govinda Devji and Radharani, and like this tenderness between them, and how much a flower, like a simple flower, could mean to her, and that she's missing her Roland. And these deities who he just kind of had no patience for or no regard for them, he suddenly feels this thing within, and so he decides he's not going to go with the sadhu, and he actually goes on a journey to Vrindavan to visit the old temple. And then he brings back, so the years pass, and then he comes back to the temple, and now no one can recognize him. He just looks like a beggar almost, and he's muttering, and he seems like a little bit crazy, like he's gone crazy in the head. And he's holding this thing in the hand, and then he just offers this like dried flower that 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 came from Vrindavan. And then he has almost like this conversation where he's saying, like, you know, like, you put me through all these things, and you know, why did you do that? And in any case, so then he has this experience and this dialogue with the deities. And then when he's leaving, one of the Purohits give him like this beautiful lotus flower, and then he understands like that the lotus is, it's a blessing from Radharani, that everything that he wanted, all the knowledge, all the scholarship, he can have that. And then he's walking outside the temple, it's like raining and things like that, and then he just tosses it aside as if it's nothing. And then he's just kind of muttering to himself and going on. And so so you understand that everything he thought that was important is not really important to him. And then there's another piece of it where there's like a flower actually starts to grow by the temple, and Radharani can enjoy that fragrance of it. And it's kind of how Vrindavan is almost like recreated in Jaipur, because when you go to this temple, you feel like the bhava as if you're in Vrindavan. And so that was important to me also, to have kind of this sense of hope, or even though there's so much loss and so much struggle and so much that we grieve for, yet there is something that lasts. So the power of bhakti, the power of our devatas, and also like the grace of our devatas. And so that they're willing to, you know, to stay with us and bless us and be with us in these different ways. So that was something I also wanted to show.
So, quite interestingly, you know, the highlight of the story, the deities are humanized in a way that they are talking to each other. They are also feeling this sense of loss and mourning, and it somehow brings us closer to them. It somehow, makes them from stone deities to actual people, real living people who feel and who are bound by some rules also, which is quite interesting. Would you like to talk more about that?
Sure. So I think this is something again that we don't understand so well. So sometimes we just see the deities are just like as symbolic, and it's just like it's just there for like our own meditation, or they're somehow like not alive. The other mistake is to think of it as like as something where they're just limited to those to whether it's stone or marble or something. It's actually something not either of those. So it's more that, like, the way we think about it is that when you do like prana pratistapana, so like there's an image or a murti or vigraha, it becomes alive when you invoke the presence of the devas into it. But the thing that happens is there's it's part of a leela, and it's part of a blessing, right? So the like Bhagavan isn't dependent on being in this form. Like there's a transcendent Bhagavan and all of that. So they don't become limited. But in order to have a stronger connection with us, or because it's helpful for us, they agree to come and like live inside these forms. And then when they do become like a true like living presence. So it's very common, like the previous Shankaracharya of Sringeri, like he would sometimes say there's a vigraha of Sharadamba, and he would sometimes say that the payasam is too hot, or it's she didn't like it today, it wasn't sweet enough. So there's also a famous photograph where you can see it, sometimes it's shared on social media, where he's like whispering into the ear of Narasimha. And so those are things where they have like a living presence, and they also have, there's like a leela where they do, if you feed them well, they enjoy the food. It's not so much that they're looking for like the quality of the cooking, but it's the quality of the bhakti and all of that. But it is a real thing, and it's a living presence, and in that form they have like different bhavas, right? And so when we say like there are particular mandirs where Shri Krishna is a child, and so when they do the arati, it'll be very soft because you don't want to disturb him, or you don't want to arouse him. So all these things are not just symbolic, but they're actually very very real. And so it's not to say that they're human, but they have, in order to interact with us, they assume kind of like this lila or this bhava or this human aspect, so we can connect with them better. And so that's the mode in which I intended those moments to be.
So I think these moments do, become the highlight of the story in a way, because we see these deities talking. Also, when we are taking up, such a task where we are giving these deities a human aspect, I think it becomes a huge responsibility on the writer who is, undertaking this task. So, what do you think that a writer who's doing this task should keep in mind while he's, providing this human aspect to the deities?
Yeah, and actually, I want to make one other point. Like another place you see this is, like in Kashi Vishwanath, there's a vigraha of like Nandi where he's facing the Shivalinga that's in the Gyanavapi that's now in the mosque. When you actually go to Kashi and you see that Nandi, like you feel the pain of that separation. So when we talk about like bhava or something like that, it's also in that mode. Then to your question about the responsibility, so this is a very like grave responsibility. So I think if you see some of the reviews that are coming out of the Adi Purush movie that has just come out, where like Sri Hanuman's kind of like talking like a gangster and things like that, like that's obviously not appropriate. So in when it comes to like Indic writing, the most important thing is what is called like rasa. So it's like that like emotion as an aesthetic, that there's a bhava or something like that. And so the most important thing if you're talking about the devas or even like our rishis or anyone is you should be able to capture the ethos of that and then the bhava of that. So when I was like, you know, humanizing the devas. So part of this is really also just based on like stories I've read about different accounts of that devotees have had with deities, like my own sadhana and things like that, and then just things from like the bhakti literature. So I haven't strayed from that. But I think the other thing is you're showing the rasa or the bhava of like kind of compassion and greatness and things that enhance bhakti. And so the idea is that they're not dependent, but they're compassionate and they're having their grace. They kind of take on this softness or what seems like vulnerability, just so we can relate to them better. So that is the most important thing, that you understand that traditionally how these devas have been conceptualized and understood and worshipped. They each have their particular qualities and lakshanas and vrittis associated with them. So when you want to write about them, you have to stay constant to that and stay true to that. So that to me is the most important thing, and also preserving a sense of reverence. So I think now what's happened is you see this in a lot of like Marvel movies or things like that, where you have like Thor or like others, or there's a series of books by Rick Riordan on like Percy Jackson, and so you have like the Greek gods and things like that, and they're humanized, but they're humanized in a different way. They're humanized as like kind of being very flawed human characters, just like any of us. And even if those movies or books come from like a good intention, but there is something missing there, because like they were great gods of different civilizations. Like if you see some of like the temples in Athens, or like the island of Delos where Apollo and Artemis were born, like these were sacred spots. It's just because we don't, they haven't been preserved. So those temples have been destroyed, and so we've lost that tradition. And so now when they're humanized, they're just like, oh, there's like a comic book character or something like that. But then you've lost the essential part, which is a sense of reverence or a sense of sanctity. So it's very important when it comes to our dharma and our devas to preserve that. And I think sometimes because we're trying to copy the West or the Western market, we lose that sense of reverence and divinity, which is essential. So I think those responsibilities are very much there for any author.
Absolutely, it's very unfortunate when we see such sacred, you know, rituals and images and gods and deities being presented in a comical way, and especially when we are presenting movies like Adipurush to children, the image that gets created in their mind, it's etched. They are young and they're like clean slate, it gets etched in their mind, so it becomes even more important to actually present our culture in a very dignified and elegant, graceful manner, as you said. So I think we all need to work on doing that.
Yeah, and
uh,
sometimes it's very small things. Like I remember one of the first things I learned as a child was like if you ever accidentally touch like a book with your foot or it fell or something, you would just like touch it and touch your head, like do a pranam to it. And like through that you instinctively understood books are an embodiment of Ma Saraswati. And you don't have to like learn it or something like that, but it just becomes ingrained in you. Why? Because you have this attitude and habit of reverence towards books and then everything that comes from that. But when you take that away, you lose that. So I think what we shouldn't confuse like having intimacy or like having like a relationship or relatability with a loss of reverence or like an essential sanctity or divinity. So you don't have to be in awe of like Bhagavan and have something be like very far away and like a cloud somewhere that you can't talk to or things like that. He or she can be like as close to you, more visible and real to you than your own parents. And you can have like a very friendly, intimate relationship with them. But they're still divine and there's still a sanctity there. And it's really having both of those and not mistaking familiarity with somehow, oh, now he's like my friend and he's no longer Bhagavan. So that's very important.
I think it couldn't be expressed in a better way than you said. um, I would like to come back to the protagonist. How did you get the idea of creating this character, Uddhav, who is looking for his identity, who is confused, who is lost in a way? Uh, Something is missing. A very significant part of him is missing. So, how did what inspired you to create this character?
Yeah, actually, in the first draft of the story, I didn't have his character at all. So it was actually the character was a girl who was from the beginning very drawn to the Govinda Devji and Radharani, and like she just wants to go on this quest. And then, actually, as I was working with my writing teacher, like Otis Hashemar, who's actually kind of coached everyone on their stories for this anthology. He was bringing up this point that when you have a story, you always tend to have like a conflict or a struggle, because if you think of a story, so like let's say you're having an argument, or let's say you're writing a book about an idea. If you're going to have a debate, then you have your idea that you want to express, but to express that idea, you have to find like the strongest like anti-idea or the rebuttal, like the opposite of that idea. And I say, okay, this is the opposite, and then this is why it's better. And then you kind of have like a battle between two ideas. That's what like a really good debate or like a nonfiction book is. When you have like a fictional book, like you have something in your mind, so you also have ideas, but you're expressing them through a story. And the story has to have like characters which kind of represent different ideas or different attitudes, and then they change over time. And actually, both of them should change. There shouldn't just be like propaganda in a sense. And so if the idea was about like the power and the importance and the sweetness of deities, then you needed a protagonist. So the protagonist is the one who actually undergoes the most change in the story, essentially, or has the biggest struggle. So then you have to have a protagonist who starts from the opposite place. And for me, that opposite place was a world where you don't need deities. You don't, this is all kind of superstition, and you should just focus on philosophy and intellectual things, and this is all kind of like a waste of time. And so he starts in this kind of painful place where his father is not doing well, and so he kind of has to earn money for the family, and so he has to do that through this job, but he really doesn't want to, and all of that. So that's kind of his struggle. And so the idea for me is if you can take someone like that who's very hard-headed, who doesn't want to do puja or do seva for Bhagavan, and then how can he actually become transformed in a way that seems, like credible, but also works with his character. And so it was hard getting that to work, but that's when I felt like, oh, I'm on the right track, because if it's very easy to write a story, then you haven't written the story you should have written. So that was kind of like the starting premise, and then it was really putting myself in his place. So if I was him, like, what would I want to do, or what are, like, and then finding like the most difficult choice. So the most difficult choice is like when you have something that you want and you can get that, but there's something else that you need, and then you have to choose between them. And so that's like the moment when he goes to Vrindavan and things like that. So once I had the protagonist in mind, then everything else kind of fell in place in terms of what kind of choices would he have to make, and things like that. What would be his struggle? And then it's just kind of fitting that into the size of a short story.
And I think it turned out beautifully well.
Thank you.
Moving on, you have been quite interested in the Puranas. I would like to ask you, why do you think it is important, especially today, to read Puranas? Apart from the religious reasons, of course, why do you think they become very important?
Yeah, actually, most of our dharma, most of our traditions and practices actually come from the Puranas. So the Puranas, first of all, are very, consistent with and like part of the Vedic corpus. So the Purana itself means old, and even if you look at the Vedas, during the times of the Vedas when you had yagyas, what would happen is you'd have like a very long yagya go on for days and days, and then there would be periods in between where you would tell, where the Puris would tell stories. So the idea of telling stories or katha has always been there, even like in the Vedas. And so the stories that got told of kings and devas and like the cosmic cycle of time and things like that, that was like simultaneously there in the Puranas. So maybe like the oldest Purana, maybe we've lost that or whatever, but the Puranas have always been there. So sometimes people have this idea that there's a conflict between Vedic Hinduism and Puranic Hinduism, which is absolutely not at all true, because all of the puja that we do today, which is Puranic, but it has its sources in the Vedas. So you used to have like Havan, and now you light a deepa, and the way you did Upasana in the fire, you do that through through image worship and things like that. And so there's that, and then it's part of it's because I love stories. So we were talking earlier about how you love literature. So I relate to things through stories. So you can tell like very abstract Vedanta, and I'll kind of get very bored and my eyes will glaze over. But if you tell me the same thing through a story, then it really resonates. So the reason I think the Mahabharata is such enduring appeal for us is because it's about dharma. But it's about dharma through stories. So you can just talk about what the Pandava is doing or what Karna is doing, and you can have all these themes and lessons about dharma. But it really sticks with us because it comes to us from stories. And so that's what really what the Puranas do. So they have like these different qualities. They have to talk about the genealogies and different characteristics to be considered a Purana. But most of all, they deal with the Vedic truths and Vedic wisdom, but in the form of stories, and then you have beautiful stotras and hymns and things in there. So for me, growing up, I really wanted to read the Puranas, and at that time it was very difficult because I can't read in Hindi or Bengali, and it's really hard to find good English translations. Nowadays, we're really lucky because they're better translations. Like Vivid Deborah has been doing an amazing job like translating the Puranas into English in a way that's very easy to read and very easy to understand. It's like reading a novel. And so I think, first of all, so now it's accessible to us. And I think when you read the Puranas, what happens is it's just universal. So there's like the classic struggles of humanity, of life, of samsara are all there. And you have profound like characters and things like that. And there's so many things you can learn, and they're very interesting. Like they're really, just very interesting and entertaining and all of that. So I feel it's very important to share that with others. So actually, like right now, I'm working on a book about Kashi, and so I've been reading the Skanda Purana, and there's an entire like Kashi Khanda where it just talks about all the different Shivalingas in Kashi and like their origin stories and things like that. And it's just you understand karma and you understand like our philosophy and things like that, but in a very direct way. And I think this is kind of the missing piece, because I think if you just go into philosophy, you miss like what the actual practice of life is and things like that. And so that's why I think it's really important to bring this back and have people connect with it. And I think in the past it just happened naturally, where you just hear it from your grandmother or things like that, or you'd have like people tell kathas in villages and things like that. So it just happened very directly, very naturally. But now, since we don't have that, we have to spend a little bit of time to do some of this reading ourselves, and so I think that's very important.
I would like to tell you that when you said, there were not enough translations or good translations when you wanted to read Puranas. So Sutradhar is exactly a step in that direction, where we create stories for young children as well as podcasts, various podcasts from Puranas and the ancient literature, basically for young people, for everybody. So that is something. We have a first question from. Okay, you're saying something?
But the other point I wanted to make is we have so much misinformation about our Puranas and our literatures. And if you actually just read, like even the Valmiki Ramayana, so sometimes people say like Sri Rama was just like a misogynist and things like that. But if you actually just read the Valmiki Ramayana, it's so obvious how besotted he was with Sita Devi, and when she was abducted, he was in so much pain and grief. Like he couldn't even move, he couldn't walk, he couldn't do anything. So a lot of it is, unless we read it for ourselves, we're dependent on others to tell us about our own tradition, our own history, and our own heritage. And you should never allow that. So whether you read the Puranas and then you think it's garbage, or read the Puranas and think, oh, there's something in here that's of value. But you should never, as thinking individuals, we should never take from anyone else to teach us about who we are. So it's actually like our duty to read these stories for ourselves and then determine for ourselves what the truth of it is. Things also like the story of Savitri and others, which were depicted as being very meek females. But if you actually read the story of her and then the respect that Yamadeva has for her, how strong a heroine she is, how all the rishis respect her and say, oh, you shouldn't worry about her. If Savitri is there, she's going to be okay. You just have a different perspective. Like we have such strong, unique, powerful, respected, and honored women with very different personality types all across the Puranas, and we don't even know this. And so at least we should read for ourselves and understand for ourselves what our literature says. And then if you don't like it, that's fine. But never allow anyone else to define you for yourself.
I think that is absolutely true, because the first time I read Uttaram Charit, I was in my graduation, and when I read it and saw the pain, the raw pain that Sri Ram goes through when Sita is not there, it had us all in tears. The entire class was crying, and we never thought there was any other greater romantic story than this.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a first question from the audience. So, what advice do you have for the first-time writers who are, trying to attempt writing Puranic fiction?
Yeah, my advice would be to really understand the like I said, like the ethos and the rasa of like the original story. So what's the, if there's a particular Purana or the Puranic story, like what is the worldview or the ethos or like the like the rasa or the pava that story is trying to inculcate. And then whatever creative liberties you want to take is fine. For the most part, as long as you preserve that rasa, and like I said, that feeling of sanctity and reverence and divinity. So I think there's actually a lot of scope for this genre, but I think that's really the important thing to keep in mind. So the first is to read and do your research, but more important than just reading a lot and knowing a lot of facts is really trying to understand, like, our Puranas and our Itihasa came through oral transmission, and there were like entire clans would be devoted to just a particular section of a particular text, and for generations they would just preserve that. So if you think about the enormous responsibility and sacrifice our ancestors have taken for so many thousands of years to preserve with such great integrity these texts and these stories, so we have to ask ourselves why, or why did they do it? It's not just because it's a good story, but because there was something important, something where we wanted to keep the memory of who we are, of lineages and genealogies and things like that, and also understand so understanding that and having a sense of responsibility of continuing that tradition, and whether and it's fine, like I said, to take liberties with that, but having that sense of responsibility or duty, or the sense of dharma, I think that's the most important part of it.
I think the young people who are trying to do this first time is definitely going to benefit from your advice. Um,
And I
since
think it's also like, and while I say all of that, I think it's also important to not be afraid. So what happens is sometimes you get like overwhelmed by that, and it just feels like too much, and then sometimes it almost like constricts you. So think about what is the best way in like the modern. So the modern story, what's different about it is that you go into characters' heads, we go into a lot more detail. So in the epics, because you're covering so much, you can only take a few lines to cover something. But when you write a novel, we really want to feel like we're experiencing it. We want the day-to-day life and like full scenes and all of that. So I think what you want to do is like think like what's the best way to express that rasa or bhava in this medium. And then also to understand how the medium works. So like what makes a short story good? What makes a novel work? And read a lot. And that doesn't have to be like Quranic fiction. It can be like all types of different genres. But I think what we're missing a little bit is some of that creativity. So from like marrying like really good storytelling with this sense of bhava. And I think if we can bring both together, that'll be like really powerful. It'll blow things like Game of Thrones and other things like out of the water. But if we can do it in a way that's like grounded in dharma and respectful of our tradition and our heritage and our that's really the win-win that we need.
I think it was Virginia Woolf who said, "Read 1,000 books and your words will flow like a river."
Yes.
Okay, so what prompted you to write love stories from ancient India? And adding on my own question, I've been waiting for this question since a while now. What is your favorite ancient love story?
What's my favorite? What?
Ancient love story.
So on the first one, like I said, it's the feeling of wanting to connect. So like for me, like reading the Mahabharata wasn't like enough for reading the Puranas, but like I said, because we read novels and the way we consume stories today is very different. So I think that's wanting to try to take that, but then express it in a different medium. So that's what started it. Now it's a little bit different, right? We're going a little bit more in like the nonfiction area. So it's more about like taking like just like lesser known stories, and I'm working on something like the Saptarishi. So like what is the Saptarishi and different ways of thinking like the 7 great rishis and their stories and things like that. Also writing about Kashi and this idea of like sacred geography. So I think this framework for understanding our Puranas and our temples and things like that. So I think it's really about just connecting with dharma and all of that. So that's the overall interest. And for me, it's also like a sadhana, like about to write about Sri Krishna. So it's part of like a practice of bhakti for me. So before I write, I was doing a little bit of Likita Japa. And so for me, it's like it's like an offering, and that's how I try to think about it. In terms of my favorite ancient love story, it's a really hard one. I think there are probably two I would like to share. So both of these are actually there in a book I wrote on Hindu love stories. But one is the story of Hamati, and this is a story of there's a great scholar, Vachaspati Mishra, and he was like a few generations after Adi Shankara, is a follower of Adi Shankara, and he was very devoted to his scholarship, and he wanted to write a tika on the Brahma Sutra. Pashya. And so, his mother wanted to get him married, but he had no interest in being married. And then he was just going to write this commentary, and then he was going to retire as a sannyasi and leave for the Himalayas. And so there was this woman, Pamati, who wanted to marry him. And then when her father found out that this is the kind of person, she thought that won't be a good match. And she said, no, he's the one I want to marry. So again, it's important that it was her choice. And so for years, he was working on this commentary, and he didn't actually even realize that she was there. So she was like refilling his ink pot and giving him fresh palm leaves to write on and things like that. And one day, as he was finishing, he noticed that this light was lit, where he was writing. He said, who lit this? And he saw the kind of like the form of her from a distance. Who is this person? Where did you come from? And she's like, we don't even remember I'm your wife. I haven't been so many years, like 15 years, 7 years, something like that. And then he realizes what she's done for him, and he's very overcome, and tears flow from his eyes, and he says, you did all this for me, I didn't even know, and now it's too late because I've made this vow. I'm going to renounce everything tomorrow, so I can't even be a proper husband to you. And she says, that's fine, because because I've accomplished what I wanted, which was to help you in your mission. And he says, let the world forget about me, but I have nothing else to give you, but let this work be named after you. So it's actually the Hamati. And so what he said is, that's the only thing I can offer you, but may the world forget about you, about me, but may your name live on forever. And so nowadays, like, Hamati is a very famous, the text is very famous, and so her name is known, but his is actually lesser known. So I love that story because of the sacrifice, and there's just a beautiful nobility to it, and this idea of love as something that you offer, not because you want something out of it, but this nobility to it is something that's very inspiring to me. So I'm probably out of time, so I won't go into the other one, but that's something that has stayed with me for a very long time.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Aditi ji. It has been, a great time. We had learning with you. We got to know so many new things, and I'm sure the audience benefited so much as well. I would like to.
I thought there was a question. Should I answer the question? There was like another question that came in. I saw on the screen.
Oh, it was the same question.
Okay, I thought there was something on what prompted me to write about love story. Okay.
Yeah. So basically, we really learned a lot from you, many new things, and I'm sure that people are going to benefit a lot from this. I would like to inform my audience that we have our next session on 25th June 9 p.m. Please connect with us. Thank you, Aditi ji, for joining with us, and thank you. We are at the end of our session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for all the wonderful questions. They're very thoughtful, and it's great talking with you. I really enjoyed it.